So I'm going to show you an image here of a cover of a book. Matthew Fox wrote a book about 1972, a book about prayer. And the title of it, it actually has the best title of a book I've ever heard of on prayer. That's On Becoming a Musical Mystical Bear. Kind of a 70s feel, right? And if you look at the cover of it, it's kind of trippy. There's a bear flying with wings, beating a drum over a field of flowers, with flowers in his mouth. And I have to admit, if you can get over the 70 kind of trip of it, it's a really interesting book on prayer. And the truth is that actually it's a book that if one reads about prayer, it's one of the most theological, biblically based books on prayer one could ever read. It's a rather small one. And his accusation at the time is that most Christians have a childlike understanding of what prayer is. That most Christians never really, and most people of faith never really, and grow up in a sense about their understanding of prayer. More often than not, we still have our understanding of prayer is very similar to what we had as kids. It's like we ask God for things and God gives us things if we're good or have enough faith, or we bargain with God. You give me this, God, I'll do this. And his observation was that many adults in the world today, in the 70s, and he would even think to these days, would say they still have that childlike understanding of what prayer is. And he said what the world needs now, what the church needs now, is an understanding of prayer that's grown up. A grown-up kind of prayer. And so in order to explain what that was, he said and would say that prayer at its heart, not simply the words we say or that we kneel at our bed and pray at night or what we say around the dinner table. Prayer really is a radical response to life. And by that he meant there are two kinds of responses. By that, a real prayerful response to life has two aspects of it. One is the sense of God's grace. One of our responses to life is to celebrate it. Mazel tov. The sense of joy of really being alive, right? That's what it means to pray, is to have that sense of the holiness of the world around us, of the gift of grace. And the joy of really being alive. And he says that's missing these days often. And then he said there's a second kind of response that's kind of radical to life that seems to be diametrically opposed to the first. And the second response is to look out in the world, in the midst of this world filled with God, and see all the suffering that is there. To grasp that there's incredible pain around us, and our response to God is we're supposed to do something about it. And so you have this twin tension, he says, in our prayers, both of joy and of a willingness to enter the suffering of the world. Now, the story of Jesus' transfiguration, which we hold up once a year, always that Sunday before Ash Wednesday, before we go into the season of Lent, is a really interesting, and let's admit it, it's an odd story, right? Kind of strange. Jesus goes up to the mountaintop with Peter, John, and James, and there's this powerful spiritual experience that happens in which the disciples, their image of God and of Jesus and of the world is transfigured. in which they really truly grasp, maybe for the first time, maybe more fully than they ever have, this truly is the Son of God. And there's even a line in which they were kind of asleep until this happened, and it's like they've woken up to seeing a reality transfigured by God's presence. It is an amazing, joyful thing, right? We even use that phrase these days. I've gone off and had a mountaintop experience, right? We use that phrase. And that is so true what transfiguration is about. The world is transfigured. It is this amazing experience in which the world looks different because we see God in it. The amazing truth of God's presence in ways we had not understood before. Now, there were two things about this story that's always bothered me as I've read it through the years. I'm not sure I can adequately respond. One is that the response of the disciples when they hear the voice of God, when they have this powerful, meaningful experience, the text says, and they were afraid. That's always bothered me. It doesn't seem like a mountaintop experience would be one in which you should be afraid, right? But I remembered when I was a kid and I went to, with the family, and I went to the Grand Canyon. Who here has been to the Grand Canyon? And I remember as a kid standing at as close as they'll let you, at the edge of the Grand Canyon, and it was the most awesome thing I've ever seen. Its vastness, ancient stones. It was amazing. I wasn't on a mountaintop, but I would say it was, kid my age, it was a mountaintop experience. And I promise you that actually it was kind of scary too. And it didn't simply because I'm afraid of height, can't stand on a chair. But something about it makes you feel so small, minuscule, as if the world, the universe is so much bigger than we ever imagined. And it gives you a sense of awe, and it's a little frightening too. Kind of, I think, their experience they had on that mountaintop, this sense in which the world is transfigured and filled with the light of God, and it's awesome, but it's a little scary. Most mountaintop experiences have that. Now, the other thing that struck me about this story on top of the mountain, the other thing that jumped out at me is they decide they're not going to tell a soul. I've never understood that. It's like they've had this agreement. We're not going to say anything to anybody about what happened. Now, in Luke, it doesn't share this, but in Mark and Matthew, it says, well, didn't tell them till after the resurrection. Makes me a little suspicious, but I wondered, why wouldn't they tell people about this amazing experience? This profoundly spiritual experience in which they're woken up to the glory of God's grace and light around them. And as I thought about it, it occurred to me I'm not totally surprised, really. There could be various reasons. Maybe they thought nobody had believed them, right? You ever had a profound spiritual experience and you're a little afraid to share it with someone? They're going to think you're crazy, right? Or have you ever had a profound spiritual experience and you can't really put into words what happened? The amazing transfiguration in yourself and in the world around you. You just can't put into words what it was. Or words aren't adequate. Or maybe, just maybe, it is so personal that that's really kind of hard to share with people, right? Now, normally, transfiguration sermons end at this point, at this profound spiritual experience, but I'm always fascinated about what happened after they came down from the mountaintop. Because immediately they're walking down the mountain, and what happens is the world hits them right in the face, right? There's a great crowd, it says, who were waiting for him, a hungry, crowd, a needy crowd, a pain-filled crowd. And there's one man in it especially who cries out to him and says, Jesus, Lord, my son is my only child. You can almost hear the agony in his voice, the pain of his voice crying out to Jesus, please help. There's this spirit that throws him on the ground and causes him to convulse and shake. These days we call that epilepsy maybe. And he says, please, please help me. So here we go from the mountaintop, this meaningful, powerful experience of God's presence and God, the awesomeness of God, and you come down the mountain and immediately you're met with the pain of the world. A profound pain of a father for their son. No hope. And then the man says to Jesus, I tried to get your disciples to heal him, but they couldn't. And again, that's another way you can tell I get bothered by Scripture a lot. That particular line, I was struggling with that in part because I'm wondering, well, why couldn't they help? And I wondered maybe they just didn't have the power to help, to ease that suffering in the world. Maybe they just weren't able to do it. Maybe they were just too busy to help ease the suffering. Or maybe, and what scares me more than anything, is they didn't even notice the suffering in the world. And Jesus, whatever reason, he's critical. And he says, y'all have failed. So the disciples on the mountaintop knowing the joy, and now they're back in the midst of the crowd in pain, and they're hitting bottom, right? And Jesus heals the boy. And everyone celebrates the goodness of God. So in that story, I heard echoes of Matthew Fox's idea about what prayer really is. Because to me, prayer and the spiritual life of those who follow Jesus always has this kind of dual component. Both the gift of joy, the sense of seeing the world alight with God, but also the call to enter the suffering of the world. And so a grown-up Christianity holds on to both of those, right? Now, last Sunday I'm going to tell on our session, which is our ruling council, and we were talking about goals for this year and goals for 5 years down the road, and we were wrestling with questions about what it means to be the church today. And I know you're glad to hear that, because session isn't always just about budgets and committee reports, but we actually try to wrestle with the spirit of our times and who we are as a church. And it was an interesting discussion because one of the things that was very important that we talked about in these particularly divided, these times of partisanship, that an important value for our church is a sense of inclusivity, a sense of including people from a wide variety of points of view. And that was important to affirm, particularly in today's world. The anger and frustration that comes out in the midst of that. And in part, one of the session members said, yeah, the church ought to be a respite from that angry, divided world. And I think we all agree, yeah, the church ought to have that sense of coming and finding a place in which we're not torn apart by the brokenness of the world around us. It ought to be, in many ways, a resting, a deep well that everyone can gather around and draw from the strength of God. But, we also talked how important it is for the church to speak to the injustices and pain around us. That to be the church is to have a grown-up kind of church which holds both the joy and respite of God's Spirit and the capacity to engage, committed to make a difference in a world of suffering. And we as a church, we as a people, we as followers of Jesus fail when we only emphasize one of those, right? When church is all about the joy on Sunday morning and the good feelings, that's a good thing. We need the mountaintop, friends. But when it's only about that, it has disconnected grace from the world. But when the church is only about engaging the suffering, without the joy of God's presence, the vision of God's transfiguration of the world, we lose hope, don't we? Then we need to carry both of those responses in our hearts and souls as disciples and as followers of Jesus. Now, I'm going to read a poem. One of my favorite poets is a woman named Mary Oliver. She is an amazing poet who, and one of the things I love about poets is I think the world is transfigured in their vision. I think they see things that often we miss. And she called this poem, she wrote this many years ago, she called this poem Song of the Builders. And it captured to me somewhat a sense of this sense of God's presence in creation around us. She often writes about nature and what nature has to teach us and what nature calls us to. And so what I love about this poem is it captures that essence, but also points to the work we have to do. Again, the title of this was Builders of the Song of the Builders. And it goes, on a summer morning, I sat down on a hillside to think about God. A worthy pastime. Near me, I saw a single cricket. It was moving the grains of the hillside, this way and that way. How great was its energy, how humble its effort. Let us hope it will always be like this. Each of us going on in our inexplicable ways, building the universe. To God be the glory this day and forevermore. Amen.